Okay, my name is Dolmage, and I'm honored to introduce a really exciting panel. The panel's title is Rethinking Creativity from a Disability Studies Perspective. And we have three wonderful speakers. I'm going to introduce them one at a time, and we'll hear. Oh, of course, yes, my thank yous. We want to thank Congress and the Canadian Federation for Humanities and Social Sciences, especially the Equity and Diversity portfolio. Melinda Smith has been the motivating force behind this and organizing force, and so thank you very much. This panel is also co-sponsored by OISE and the University of Toronto, the University of Toronto Press, the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, and is organized in partnership with the Canadian Disability Studies Association and the Canadian Philosophical Association. Our first presenter today is Tanya Titchkosky. Tanya is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the U of T, where she also holds the positions of Associate Chair and Graduate Coordinator. Incredible. After the completion of her PhD in Sociology at York in '97, Tanya spent almost a decade teaching at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. Woohoo! In 2006, she moved to the University of Toronto. Any woo-hoos for that? Tanya has authored 3 books published in the University of Toronto Press. Most recently, The Question of Access, which is available in the hallway. It's a wonderful, very, very important landmark book in disability studies and disability studies in Canada. She's also co-edited with Rod Michalko, Rethinking Normalcy, a Disability Studies Reader.
Thank you. How's the mic coming through to you? Good. So it's Rethinking Creativity and Innovation from a Disability Studies Perspective, and we were invited to think about how disability studies might offer an alternative way of knowing or alternative approaches to producing knowledge. So what I thought I would do today is just try and do that. Instead of talking about doing that, I'm going to try and do it. This is called Evacuating Disability Innovation on the Edges of the Human Community. A very hot day in July 2011 marked the end of a week-long International Disability Studies Summer Institute at OISE, University of Toronto. I was directing the Summer Institute, and I was certain that fewer than 50 of us would be together for the final day. I worried a little that the intensity of this week might inhibit the desire to get together on a Saturday and think through our experiences. But as it turned out, we were 30 or so, set to do the work of drawing out the projects tentatively incubating throughout our time together. And in the midst of a July heat wave in Toronto, OISE felt luxurious in its relative coolness. Perhaps, I thought, this is the best way to spend this Saturday. Oh, by the way, if anybody would like to follow along, there's large print copies. Thanks, Melinda. Large print copies have a paperclip in the top left-hand corner, and there's just there's 15 copies, so whoever wants to follow along, you might want to make a gesture. Thank you. Thanks. There's a couple of people over here. Thank you. The orienting aims for this gathering of the Summer Institute, of both local which gathered together both local and international disability studies scholars, were rather simple. To address the conceptions of disability at work both in and out of disability studies, so as to rethink them anew. To bring conceptions of race and disability in touch with one another, so as to revisit their ongoing separation. To do something other than celebrate disability studies' arrival into the academy, or to proclaim its marginal status as forgotten sister of those academic endeavors that have preceded us. Basically, I hope to reflect on what it was we were already doing as a way to do something different. There's chairs up front, too. Sorry. That's okay, come on in. I'm just telling a story of a Disability Studies Summer Institute in a heat wave. in July 2011. We're all set up, and then the unexpected happens. And everything changed. Collective intentions for future projects were suddenly overwrit by big thud-like steps, strident steps, and more of them. Through the open door of our 5th floor classroom, we noticed firefighters proceeding past. Well, no alarm rang, their voices did. They were calling out to each other. Soon, I left the classroom and realized it was access to the balcony on the 5th floor that the firefighters were seeking, and I began to look for the security phone. I did not find the security phone, nor any other, since the payphone outside the accessible washroom was missing from the wall. A shaded paint stain indicated to me that a phone was once here. Despite no phone, and just as the firefighters started using the butt of an axe to break through the glass balcony door, a security person showed up who was pressed into service to open the door. Now the hall was filled with the sound of firefighters' loud voices issuing directions to each other, as well as the electronic clatter of voices over walkie-talkies. There was also the thudding sound when they attempted to break locked doors, and then, once the balcony was accessed, the smell of smoke flowing into our hallway near our classroom. While no one was speaking to our group, all these unusual sounds, sights, and smells led me to conclude this brilliant thought. I believe I should talk to someone in charge. One firefighter was standing near a red fire hose box near the balcony door, also near our classroom. To this firefighter, who was semi-stationary, unraveling a fire hose, I said, "Should we evacuate?" "Yes," he said. I said that there were many people in our classroom who had mobility and other impairments. He said that the fire was out on the balcony. The firefighter did not appear too concerned, and I began to glean the impression that soon the fire would be under control. After all, no alarm was sounding. So stating more than asking, I said, "Oh, so we don't have to evacuate?" "No, evacuate," was the reply. I repeated my prior comment and said that many people in our classroom have mobility impairments. This did not seem to make an impression on him, and he did not respond. I got more specific, saying that there were wheelchair users, people with visual impairments, people who had a limp. There were people who, if forced to use the stairs, would face danger. I said very emphatically that we needed assistance, and the firefighter said that he would send someone over. But the walkie-talkie, so frequently in use in the hallway, remained silent. I continued. "Given that the fire is outside the building, could we use the elevators?" "No," said the firefighter, since the elevators were under the control of the fire department now. He continued his work of unraveling the hose. Repeating myself, I said that evacuating by the stairs would be a problem. A different firefighter said, while moving out of the building and onto the balcony, that he would send someone over. This too never happened. In the meantime, I returned to the elevator area, thinking perhaps I simply missed locating the security phone, but all I found was a big blue poster that read, I put this up on the screen, it's about 2 feet by 2 feet, and it has a little card holder, that's your business card, goes in there. I just pointed at the poster on the screen, which reads, "Mobility impaired fire procedures. When stairs are not an option, know what to do, be safe." The be safe means you take the card from down below, and this is a picture taken from the day of the fire. This poster had little plastic slot that I've indicated that holds cards, stamped with a big University of Toronto icon on one side, and security phone numbers on the opposite side in tiny 8 font, perhaps smaller lettering. I was sorry, though, to find that the cards were missing. I did not have a pen on me, and given my dyslexic ways, I did not even attempt to memorize the security phone numbers posted outside the elevators. Then I heard a voice behind me say, "Evacuate." Back in the classroom, others had received the same message, and people moved. People carried their colleagues down the stairs. One person slid down on their bum, potentially exacerbating a health condition, while colleagues carried a wheelchair. Others risked their own safety, sliding their foot down while grasping a rail in one hand, a colleague in the other. For some, unfamiliar with the stairwells and reaching what they assumed was the locked exit door, at the mezzanine level, a deep sense of dread ensued. Anxieties abounded. Moving toward the stairwell to wait our turn down the stairs, firefighters were still striding by, seemingly indifferent to our presence. The last 4 of us to evacuated represented the distinctive diversity of our group, maybe any group, with various sensory, emotional, physical, and learning differences. I'm skipping down a little bit. Colleagues who first left the building did not know if everyone made it down and tried to inform the firefighters of this fact via the campus police, but the police threatened trespassing charges if any further attempts to communicate were made. As a group, we eventually figured out that every one of our group was out of the building. We waited outside during a heat wave, insisting that we needed to talk to the fire department, and waited long after the crisis had passed. We tried to engage police and security to discuss events, but I was told by campus police to keep my ideas in my head, since this was now a fire investigation. I said that we, as a group, were part of what needed to be investigated. Hostility, but nothing that looked like assistance was offered. No one's health needs were assessed by anyone officially involved in the evacuation. Some people had headaches, some were crying, some were sweating profusely, some were talking, and others taking notes or pictures. Campus police then began to take our pictures, as we were now the troublemakers. Eventually, we spoke to the fire department's district chief about how there was a general failure to acknowledge us in our particularity, exacerbated by the failure to acknowledge what we had just gone through. Thus our point, put most succinctly by one UK participant, not the fire, she said, but instead the evacuation itself was the danger. Emergency officials, processes, as well as all the missing and impoverished emergency structures all worked together that day to fan this tiny little fire into a blazing display of voided mutual human recognition, including a lack of recognition for embodied differences. So, whatever else this account might be, it represents the edges of routine everyday life, edges that are good to think with. Putting a quote on the board, which I'm about to read. Edges that are good to think with. That is, in Rod Michalko's terms, or words, this story is, quote, born of the aporia that engenders the interrogation of what it means to be human, both individually and collectively, end quote. The aporia, the perplexity, the puzzle, the wonderment. How is this possible? This is a space for thought, not just for pointing at injustice, but a space to think about the production of injustice. Of course, at one level, it is simply an emergency crisis and thus unwanted. But how now to relate to this event so as to produce an innovative response? The sort of response that helps us rethink and re-engage by bringing into consciousness the established ways we have to make sense of self and others in spaces not necessarily of our own choosing. Let us start with the most obvious deadly irony. Through this emergency situation, an array of practices combined that vividly illustrated a primary interest of the Disability Studies Summer Institute, namely, the social constitutions of humanity and its outsiders. My story points to those edges, and even to how such edges are built through everyday practices, but how to theorize them, how to bring a different, more innovative and creative response into play. I really do think that's our question, because we can all tell the story I just told, or some version of it. In the following, I hope to demonstrate that a disability studies approach offers a form of creativity, where disability is not only an object for inquiry, but a space of inquiry. I think that's a radical difference that we have to hang on to, those who do disability studies. A space of inquiry. And I'm going to try and do this through 4 basic moves. I think, though, I'm going to run out of time.
You're at 12 minutes. You've got 8 more minutes.
I get 1 extra minute, right? No, I'll need to be cut off, but I'm going to try and get through 4 basic moves of inquiry to work with here that I think disability studies offers us. So here you get the conclusion, and then I'll try and actually do the moves. 1, attend to obvious problems for their not so obvious grounds. 2, stay put. Re-enter stories about the obvious problems to denaturalize them. 3, in denaturalizing the obvious, Find ways to locate self and engage others as part of the story. That is, show how there is no exit. And 4, nurture an expanded sense of the human community by telling complex, unexpected stories. Avoid simplifications. Do more than evacuate. Do more than point. In everyday and academic culture, Paul Aberle, disability studies scholar, reminds us that it is ordinary to be interested in disability only as a problem. And many, many, many disciplines work on this problem, taken for granted as such. Quote, more than 1 billion people are estimated to live with some form of disability, or about 15% of the world's population, says the most recent World Report on Disability 2011. Yet, disability is often treated as 1 billion individual problem nodes in need of individualized solutions. So, the first move in generating an innovative approach is to consider how disability is taken as an obvious problem in the first place. That is, if we are to do more than point out inequality, inequity, and injustice, our first move will need to be to find ways to address and describe the configuration of the problem that gets us animated to do this pointing in the first place. Why do I need to tell you the story? I have to figure out why I need to tell you the story. Or put differently, how can we find ways to address the obvious sense of an obvious problem for the hidden modalities of being, for what isn't so noticeable, what isn't so obvious? It may seem obvious enough that a fire on an outside balcony that prompted no official to sound the building's fire alarm represents only a little crisis poorly managed. And there are other obvious matters at hand. For example, everyday understandings of expected bodies in social space. Turning to the not so obvious, we might ask, whose ends were served by my descriptions of impairments as easy reads within an environment that typically regards impairments as danger or as a mere object of study? After all, these descriptions of moving differently, of walking and seeing differently, can easily serve to make impairment seem like both the cause and the consequence of this evacuation. Disability is typically conceptualized and documented as a reasonable place to locate many problems, especially within a faculty of education, where solving the problem of disability is many people's bread and butter. OISE's promotion, where I work, the promotional material proudly professes that here people work on the problem of autism, the problem of facial recognition, the problem of different brains, the problem of core deficits, behavioral problems, the problem of Aboriginal people's mental health, the problem of learning differences and differential educational schemes, the problem of educating health educators about the problems diversity of embodied problems are. Disability as problem, routinely depicted as an individual one too, located inside individuals' minds, bodies, senses, and emotions, and perhaps even in my story, evacuates disability from its social and historical moorings. Thus, in both my communication with the firefighter and in my narration of this story to you, it is more than possible that in noting various bodies' particular movements in an evacuation, I reproduce the problem. If I'm only pointing at the crisis in this evacuation, it is likely that I do little to draw attention to the unimaginative version of the normal evacuee perpetuated by this scenario, and instead reproduce the notion of bodies of trouble. There is a Foucauldian echo here in suggesting that most of what we know, and much of what we can come to know, is tied to the reproduction of what already is. Our critical terms for critical engagement grow from and flow back into the world, in Steicher's terms, such as it is. The possibility for innovation, for change, is interwoven with facing our essential embeddedness. We're here. That we can't get out of being in the world may make for many failed revolutions. But these real limits to human potentiality for change also offer some promises. Resisting hubris, resisting the notion that we are gods who can know and in knowing step out of human affairs, allows for a praxis, a set of practices that require some sort of staying put, as staying engaged as a way to work toward a creative crisis, which is not like an emergency crisis that requires us only to get the hell out. Such staying put, not accepting our elimination from the scene, maybe even reflecting upon the most current terms of how we're being engaged, are ways to recognize and perhaps expand our sense of the human community. So, I'm about to move to the second move. How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Oh my. Okay, we're just going to do the second move, and you can imagine move 3 and 4. So the first move is to generate an innovative response and to notice how and what we take problems to be. The second move is to stay put with these problems once they are conceived, noticed, pointed out. And maybe actually I'll skip this section because you could read about how we, I'm holding up my new book, how we can stay put with how access is and isn't done. And so I'm going to move ahead. No, I'm not. No, I'm just going to do move 2 and call it a day. By re-entering the stories we already are, this is like a restless, reflexive return. By starting from the most basic sense that noticing disability as a problem is a social act, allows for rereading the story of problem or of danger that does not locate either in nature, necessity, or as just the way things are. Innovation requires a critical orientation that suggests that there is nothing natural to be found in this evacuation. Inadequate and wrong as they were, the physical environment, the evacuation procedures, the forms of engagement by the firefighters, security, campus police are social. They are social practices, not predetermined by nature, not even by the nature of fires. The social practices and structures of evacuation interacted with this particular group of people, transforming our difference or impairments into disabilities, and further transforming disabilities into danger. To believe otherwise requires that the body be decontextualized. Thus, not bodies, but rather their decontextualization can now be understood as part of the crisis behind the dangerous evacuation scenario. Understanding the evacuation in this way can put into crisis the taken-for-granted sense of disability as problem that the evacuation nonetheless relied on and certainly reproduced. An innovative and creative approach, such as is disability studies, asks us to stay put with acts of decontextualization, to re-engage them anew. Part of the way that we can re-engage them anew is to try to tell stories that make other people understand that this is not just our limited story, but this is a story that they belong to as well. To generate something new, then, means to re-enter the stories that we already are, and finding ways or mechanisms to get others to recognize that this story, our story, is your story and is their story. This is a story of the human community. And I think that's the second move there, is that disability studies needs to find more and more ways to tell stories that allow people to understand them as our story, OUR stories. That we need to claim these stories and help other people to claim these stories. And I think things would have gone much differently that day had anybody there recognized that evacuation as their story. And that's part of the reason I'm still telling this story, is to try and convince others that this is not my story. This is our story. And we've heard it many times before. The question is, how do we enter the story to make something new out of it? Thanks very much.
Okay, I'll ask that we hold our questions until the end, because these talks are going to come together in really interesting ways, and so that'll be a good time to address that. I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Prince. Dr. Prince teaches policy and organizational analysis in public administration and social policy. Current research interests include trends in social policy over the past 25 years and the next generations, federal-provincial relations, Aboriginal governance, and policy making in disability politics and policy issues. He is currently co-principal researcher with the Council of Canadians with Disabilities on a 5-year Community University Alliance project entitled Disability Poverty Enabling Citizenship. His most recent book, published by U of T Press and also available in the hallway, is Absent Citizens, Disability Politics and Policy in Canada.
I will stand up here for the benefits of the video. Thank you. Thanks, Jay, and thank you all. And it's a delight to be. There are copies of both a PowerPoint I'm going to show and paper I've written, both in large print and in 12 font and 16 font. I think there are the two versions that are available. It's a delight to be here. It's a delight to be on a panel with Rod and Tanya, whose work both singly and collectively I've admired and used and quoted over the last several years. And this is my first time to be working and speaking with them. So this is a great privilege and a great delight to be part of this. And I'm glad that this is being recorded in some way as well. There aren't enough copies of the paper for everyone or the slides, but these are available. Well, maybe I'll turn this on. Would that be better? This way I can walk around and you can hear this so much better. Okay. We've already heard that what we were invited to think about in terms of considering how disability studies as an academic field of inquiry can consider issues around creativity and innovation with respect to the production of knowledge. And Tanya has very nicely illustrated both the presence of and the power and potential of stories. And in my paper I touch briefly on those as well, and I'll come to locate those within some larger political and bureaucratic debates and practices that I think we can see happening across Canada. The paper explores basically three questions, and I'll take the next 12 or 15 minutes to make some remarks about each in turn. One is, what kinds of knowledge circulate in and around what we might call the disability sector or the disability community in Canada? And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about what I imagine that to look like. The second question is, how does this kind of knowledge or knowledges connect with and circulate around and interact with the Canadian state and other institutions in Canadian society? And the third question we were all asked to consider is what the future might hold for disability studies in Canada in terms of a more creative and innovative knowledge production, I think for the purposes of, among other things, activism and social transformation and change. So let me just, whoops, I went too fast and I've already gone forward.
And it's hard to go back.
It's hard to go back and say, well, wasn't that part of your story? There we go, wow. Let's just take a breath here, okay. First slide here says Canadian disability community on the top. And when we look at the Canadian disability sector, other words might be used, the movement, the sector, the policy community, the policy field. In my book, which Jay nicely mentioned and plugged, I spent a lot more time on this in a particular one chapter, but I suggest we can look at and think about the Canadian disability community as comprising a number of arenas or sectors or fields. And what I list on the slide is 5 of them. One is, first of all, the community is a diverse sector of service-oriented organizations. I think for most Canadians, when they think of disability or the disability sector or disability services, they would think of organizations like probably Easter Seals, March of Dimes, Heart and Stroke, etc., etc. Some of these are over 100 years old. Some of them are the first and largest voluntary or charitable organizations established in Canada in the 19th century, which continue on into the 21st century. Not all of them are specific impairment-based organizations, but a lot still are. And much of the annual fundraising and charitable drives that you probably receive phone calls during the dinner hour, as well as mailouts and so forth, are from organizations in this sector. There still are telethons, both locally, nationally, or regionally, and in the United States from this sector. So for a lot of Canadians, this is perhaps some of the image, the knowledge, the information they get about what disability and disablement is. It's a diverse sector. In the paper, I talk a little bit about some of the changes in creativity that's going on within it, in terms of particularly some of the older traditional organizations trying to transform themselves, trying to modernize themselves in response to or in light of challenges and demands and expectations to move off more traditional paternalistic or charitable or biomedical models of care and support to something more supporting justice, self-determination, inclusion, etc. Another arena is thinking of the disability community as a policy sector, a constellation of interest groups and coalitions and alliances. And some of this involves, of course, self-advocacy, as well as collective and systemic advocacy, and more political activities. And I'll come back to this a bit more. The third is to think about the Canadian community as I'll call it comparatively new social movement. And I mean new in both ways, of both of the social policy or sociology literature as a new versus an old social movement, but also new chronologically in terms of its configuration. Some of it has old roots, but by and large, when we think of the disability movement in Canada, I think we're looking at activities that really have come to the fore since the 1970s. And more importantly, particularly probably since the 80s and 90s, and taking lessons from and interacting with other social movements, the feminist movement, Aboriginal self-determination, and others. I won't go into what I find is a slightly dry debate about is it a true new social movement or not, that British scholars seem to have been much more exercised about than Canadians or Americans, and I'll leave it to the Brits to continue to be exercised about that. I think uniquely Canadian is to think of the community in a fourth way as a constitutional category. 30 years ago, in 1982, people with mental and physical disabilities, as the language was used at the time, was included. Those four words were included in Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Canada was the first country to entrench language like that in a Bill of Rights and a Constitution. Some others have followed since. There's a large debate as to what that has meant, and for those who had high hopes, they've probably been disappointed, and on the other hand, those with grave fears of entrenching a charter in our Constitution and perhaps stealing supremacy of Parliament's powers, they too live in a very different world now, where Parliament doesn't really have much to do or say about anything. The fifth sector, is really the theme of today, is to think about the community as a research and knowledge production network. And that's what much of my remarks will focus on. The next slide, again, for an audience like this, I won't belabor this point, but that when we think about knowledge and information and discourse and debate and dialogue around issues of ability, disability, impairment, disease, inclusion, exclusion, etc., that there are a range of perspectives, a range of philosophies, a range of paradigms, if you want to use that word, models, ways of thinking and talking about these issues. Here on the slide, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but just to make the point that there are several simultaneously existing perspectives that clash and compete and collide and contend with each other for people's support, people's attention, resources, etc. Charitable paternalism, which is going back at least to in our heritage and legacy of a country, back to the Elizabethan Poor Laws of the 16th century, which came over into Canada, or pre-Canada, in the colonial settler society. Spiritual humanitarianism. I put this one in, and I just noticed in the latest issue of Abilities magazine, a program at St. of X that's on a diploma in intellectual disability that speaks specifically about spiritual aspects of disability care. So I don't feel so out on a limb saying this as I did perhaps when I wrote it a while ago. Practices of medical expertise. Clearly this is the medical model, the medicalization of so much in our lives. The next one refers to welfare or warfare statism. The welfare state, of course, often, again, this ties back to Tanya's point about problematizing groups. People in need, people with deficits, but also with benevolence and other motives as well. Warfare statism, I'm trying to highlight there specifically the issue of civilians and veterans, the casualties of war, and how there's a slightly distinctive debate and discourse, not only in Canada but in other countries, around how we treat people who have impairments and disablements as a result of warfare. And the history of most welfare states include a very parallel and differential kind of treatment for veterans. And that many of our programs today that civilians enjoy in Canada were first introduced through Veterans Affairs Canada or its predecessors after World War I. So a lot of the income supports, home care, social services, education benefits, and so forth. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I think given Canada's involvement in armed conflicts again, in a way that we've not seen since Korea or the Second World War and Afghanistan and Iran and so forth, we're seeing a whole new generation of veterans. And we're seeing different kinds of impairment issues and disabled. And we're seeing, quite frankly, a struggle or battle going on between veterans and the Department of National Defense, Veterans Affairs, and the Government of Canada over benefits. And we got questions there of deservingness and some of the classic issues of stigma and so forth. So just to put that one in your thoughts. Another perspective, forbidden narratives. And this is the, pushing and pulling what stories are allowed to be told, what experiential stories, and I say up on the slide, versus official rhetoric, which I'll come to in a minute. And then there's discourses on what are the causes of oppression, the nature of it, and the consequences or effects of systemic oppression, which clearly is a major discourse that comes out of disability studies. Again, particularly in the United Kingdom and other countries, to some extent, but perhaps not as framed consistently and strongly as that in the Canadian context. So we have in this knowledge community or knowledge production circulating at any one time quite a stew or soup there of different perspectives. The next slide is called Canadian State as a Site of Knowledge Power on Disability. And here, and in the paper, I just want to mention briefly about 5 different images, 5 methods. Again, I don't pretend that this covers everything. People might choose to want to phrase these differently in your own language. But some of the ways that knowledge is both produced, shared, circulated, manipulated, maneuvered, managed, ignored, and used by public authorities, be it government officials or other public and private organizations in the Canadian context. And to pick up on a concept that Tanya was just saying, some of these may seem more obvious and more natural, and others might seem less obvious or less conventional in their way. The first one, though, fairly straightforward. Governments do produce a huge amount of data, and they do engage quite actively in the dissemination of information, whether that's through social surveys by Statistics Canada and other agencies, the equivalent statistical bodies of provincial governments, even some social planning agencies of large city governments in the country. There's huge administrative data sets that government agencies hold, be it around things like workers' compensation, healthcare, long-term disability programs, in the corporate or in the public sector. The Canada Pension Plan disability is a huge data set. Employment insurance, sickness benefits, etc., etc. So other kinds of work there are done through contract work, where governments, even in times of budget restraint, continue to contract out, modestly perhaps, to consultants, academics, and think tanks in generating data research. I would have to say, though, that most of this information is either not readily available or made easily accessible or is known publicly or used by groups that perhaps, for a whole host of reasons, we come back to that. The second technique or modality is the suppression of information sharing and knowledge generation. And this is done partly through rules of confidentiality and official secrets. Sometimes it's done by governments deliberately not engaging with groups or engaging in conversations or consultations. It also happens by cutting programs. A good example is the Canada Court Challenges Program, which has had an on-again, off-again history over the last 25, 30 years, where groups were funded and given monies for what's called intervener status to launch equality rights cases using the Charter to make legal precedents. The group that used it the most over the last 30 years have been Aboriginal organizations. The second most active group have been disability groups, followed by then the women's movement and minority language groups. That was a key strategic resource and set of funds for disability groups to launch disability rights cases. That was terminated by the Harper government shortly after it first came into office in 2006. In a way, to me, that's a way of managing knowledge and exercising power. Third one is hierarchical classification of knowledge. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this hierarchical from the point of view of dominant ways of governing and the dominant ways of thinking of what counts as knowledge, and who gets to say what counts as knowledge. And those in power or influence usually are the ones who get to say that telling stories, personal stories, is at the low end of the hierarchy. Narratives are nice, and we will put them in government reports. You'll see them in Royal Commission reports, and perhaps even photographs of the storytellers. But that really doesn't count or measure up from policy and decision makers. They need to see something more quantitative, more rigorous, more objective. Not always, but this is the tone of the context I think we live in. Going up from, be it quantitative methods to random controlled comparison groups and quasi-experimental. If we could afford those, it doesn't always work in social policy. But there's this idea that there's a gold standard of what knowledge and evidence is. We see it particularly through Canadian Institute for Health Research, certainly on evidence-based medicine, evidence-based nursing, evidence-based social work, evidence-based fill in the blank. What that does is it devalues, and as Foucault would say, it hierarchizes or ranks information. And trying to get those personal, on-the-ground, ordinary knowledge in is a tough battle. A fourth technique is the regulation of information production. A good example of this is under the tax laws for civil society organizations or NGOs that want to be registered as charities with Canada Revenue Agency. And again, Mr. Harper's reminded us recently, he's focused in on environmental non-governmental groups at the moment. But this has had a chill over social activist groups across the registered charity community. The 90-odd thousand, I think it is, might be higher than that, registered charities who've been made pretty clear to them they better proceed very cautiously in how they engage in public policy advocacy. Because if it's more than 10% of their operations, they'll be audited, they'll be scrutinized, and they could lose their registered charity status. That's one way of regulating the way information gets generated, circulated, and gets contested in our society. Another one, more subtle perhaps, not as dramatic, but happens, is through grants and contributions from federal government departments to community groups, and what they will or will not be funded for, and how they could, in their request to proposal back to funding opportunities, rather than saying we're going to engage in, and I've had personal experience with this in BC with groups getting funding, we were no longer able to use words like social justice or advocacy. We had to talk about family education. We couldn't even talk about leadership development. That seemed too political by the funders. I'm talking about public funders. Foundations happily became a little more flexible with us on some of these issues. But in other words, you get engaged in some games over how you get to frame what you're going to do or what you're actually literally going to actually have to do in activity. Fifth one is co-optation. This might be through how ideas that may be more radical or critical or creative in civil society or in social justice movements or in other groups get absorbed into conventional practices and maybe neutralized, maybe somehow annexed in some way. They may be given some legitimacy and some recognition, but paradoxically, with that recognition comes perhaps some dilution of the content and the power behind them. So those are just some considering about how knowledge connects and interacts with state organizations. The next slide talks about the politics of knowledge production, and here I just wanted to, these are kind of some summary remarks or observations really. I originally thought I only had 10 minutes, so I really, so I'm taking advantage of the little extra I have now. I didn't want to tell Tanya that. But really, we'll talk about knowledge production, and I'm partly a political scientist, so I look at these things through that particular perspective or lens. But again, there are numerous ways of knowledge and discourse around disability being manufactured, the way it gets managed, the way it gets maneuvered. And that's as much within the disability groups and organizations as it is by bureaucrats or politicians. I don't want to paint a picture of good guys, bad guys here. There's plenty of tricks and games that go on everywhere. So this isn't trying to just single out one sector or one group. And I think knowledge production, at least there's always need for new information. There's always going to be a need to, we don't know enough about this or that. But a lot of the politics I see isn't about trying to create new evidence to shine light into an area of darkness and ignorance that we don't know, that enlightenment model of knowledge production. It's more that we already have a whole bunch of different kinds of knowledges circulating around, interacting, colliding, competing with one another, and the politics is how those play out, how those get seen as which ones are listened to, which ones either obtain or are granted credibility, legitimacy, and some authority in influencing decisions and choices. One of my old favorite quotes is from a book by Schneider from 1960 called The Semi-Sovereign People. And he talks about politics being organization, it being the mobilization of bias. Any organization is the mobilization of bias. So is any policy, any program, any research project, any talk is the mobilization of bias. He said that over 50 years ago. So I'm paraphrasing it here and saying, well, with respect to the knowledge production on disability, certain ideas and information on disability are organized into the debate and into policy making, and at the same time, certain ideas and information are organized out. And in one of the previous slides, I tried to suggest some of the techniques of how things might either get organized in, organized out, organized high in an agenda, organized low in an agenda. So there's always going to be this contention. Quickly, just on the future for disability studies, I talk a little bit about the current state of the field here in Canada in the paper. Here, I think I'll just leave with some 3 points. The first one has to do with, on the future, has to do with the question of methodology and empirical research. That there's a good deal of historical knowledge, whether it be in administrative data sets or in the lived experiences of activists in organizations or previous times of activism in the movement, that we need to continue to recover and to write and share and celebrate on. I think that's really important. So a big part of the future needs to be paying attention to the past before it disappears, and before a whole generation of activists and leaders pass on. A second point has to do with theory and conceptual work, and that's taking notions of power and knowledge that acknowledge both the negative consequences and effects of power and the more productive potential of power and authority, and to look at the full range of instruments that are used in policy, whether it's in civic organizations or in state structures. The third point is one to do with praxis, or the connection between the political and organizational, is that disability studies needs to remain connected with disability activism, or it risks what some other disciplines where maybe some of us started in our careers and have gravitated to this area, is that things can become kind of dry, abstract, or arid if they don't remain grounded and connected, and there's a good interaction between activists and activism and the studies. So thank you, and on this last slide, I've got the link to the CURA, the Community University Research Alliance that Jay mentioned at the beginning, this 5-year SHIRT grant. It's been added, we've got a 6th year, no new money, we're just spreading the money over 24 months, so don't think we've got a little extra money from but we're probably planning an event this November in Ottawa. We've done a series of these, what we call end exclusion events. We'll have another one this fall probably, where we'll bring together a large group of students, academics, activists, administrators, wanting to look at an agenda for reform, looking ahead to the next 5 to 10 years, and looking at how different kinds of knowledges, stories, and information may inform that. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, our third and final speaker today will be Rod Michalko, Associate Professor of Equity Studies at the New College at the University of Toronto. Rod teaches disability studies in this Department of Equity Studies. He's also adjunct professor of disability studies in the Critical Disability Studies program at York University. Rod is the author of numerous articles and 4 books, and is one of the very most important people in the Canadian disability studies movement.
Thank you. As soon as you got to very important, I didn't know what he was talking about. Well, Michael was up again. Anyway, thanks thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak here today. I want to thank all of the organizations that sponsored this, and I want to thank Jay for chairing this, and I especially want to thank Melinda Smith for considering disability as part of taking part of the Congress this year. Is she here?
Yes.
Melinda, we should give her a hand, seriously. I should tell you that yesterday Melinda asked me, well actually told me, for those of you who know Melinda, told me to behave myself. Now, you people know me, some of you. I always behave myself. So here I go behaving myself. If I go too long, if Michael or someone needs to unfold my cane and give me a shove, and I'll stop, okay? What I want to do today is, I don't have a formal paper, I did one earlier this morning, but what I wanted to say, some of you know this, and maybe some of you don't, but as of June 30th, I'll be retiring from the university realm, and I am thrilled. Because I'm not a corporate manager, so I think my career is limited.
That went over well.
Are there some managers in? I'm sorry.
It's a tough room, right?
It's a tough. Okay, so what I've done though, what I'm doing is just finishing up another book where basically I'm trying to think about or reflect upon what I've been doing in disability studies for the last number of years, and I'm saying that quite seriously in terms of trying to figure out what it is I've been doing and trying to figure out what disability studies is in a certain kind of way. You know, we can all define it, and it's been defined by many, many people, including me, but I want to just take some of those ways of thinking about it and maybe just reflect on disability more than I have been. And that's part of the of this new project I'm just about finished, and so I'm just going to give you a few thoughts from that project now for the next 10-15 minutes. I want to start, because I'm a sociologist, I want to start with the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. And he says, among other things, he says that all words have meaning, and some even have a feelings. And I think we all can kind of get a sense of that. I mean, particularly those of you engaged in the what's called nowadays social media, Facebook, etc., writing emails and stuff like that. Sometimes my jaws doesn't read some of the words, like the words that have meaning and feeling. Like when something's messed you up or messing you up, you go ack or arg, you know. And I know those probably not in any dictionary, but nonetheless, you get a sense of those words of having a meaning and a feel. Curse words are like that, but I'll leave it up to you to think of your own curse words that have a meaning and a feel that you want to sort of communicate. But there are words that have both a meaning and a feeling, I suggest, and I think that one of those words is disability. It certainly has meaning, and it certainly has a feel to it. It feels many different things to many different people, and it means many different things to many different people. Now, I don't mean some sort of a rampant kind of relativism, where it can mean, you know, as they say, one thing to that person, another thing to another person, and so on, although there is some of that. But that's sort of steeped in kind of notions of some collective sense of disability. And people have often tried to change concepts of disability by changing the word. Now you know what I mean. The word sometimes gets written in a certain kind of way. and it gets written sometimes as open brackets, dis, close brackets, ability, or sometimes brackets and then capital A, ability, and so on, trying to emphasize or at other times de-emphasize certain meanings and a certain feel of disability. There's a student of mine that I had in a disability studies class about 3 years ago said something interesting to me. She said that she really loves the word disability because she treats the first 3 letters, dis, as a chance to diss ability. So she says disability is really dissing ability. So, you know, I'm going to stick with that. I kind of like that feel. So I'm going to go with that. But I want to now talk a little bit about a conception of disability that is, I think, if it's not global, we're going to make it global very, very soon. Because we export all kind of stuff all over the world, don't we? From this part of the world. But one of the more global things about disability, a feel and a meaning, is something that I'm going to quote David Mitchell, a disability studies scholar, and this quote has probably been quoted as much as Rosemary Garland Thompson's Normate. So I'm sure most of you know this quote. But David says at some point in 2 or 3 of his publications that nearly every culture views disability as a problem in need of a solution. And that's kind of one of the ways that disability comes to us. Its meaning, its feel, and it comes to us in all kinds of different ways. Some of us see it in print, some of us hear the sound, some of us are disabled, some of us know disabled people, but we all know disability. It comes to all of us. And one of the universal ways it comes to us, David Mitchell suggests, is as a problem, but not just as a problem in need of a solution, which is a particularly kind of Western idea. And it's difficult in this culture that we live in the West, and particularly since the Enlightenment, to even think, let alone say the word problem without immediately thinking solution. Problems for us have become, generally speaking, things that are sort of bad, we just don't want. And I even heard a dean at a university I taught in out west, it was actually in the east. I didn't want to say St. F.X. University. But the dean of St. F.X. University said, when I was the chair of the sociology department there at one point, not to come to her with problems, just solutions. So I thought I would come with I would just come to her and say, 7. which is a solution to the problem of 3 plus 4. But I would just give her a whole bunch of solutions. And then of course she'd have a problem. So I just want to continue this idea of problem by talking about like disability understood, experienced, sensed, felt, meaning a problem or some kind of trouble. And of course, disability as a problem, you know, all of us, that doesn't differentiate non-disabled people from disabled people at all. I mean, everybody has problems or troubles from time to time. Some quite serious, some often. Other people have maybe less serious problems or troubles. But nonetheless, as people, we all have trouble or problems from time to time. But there is a different sense of the word of problem. And I'm going to just quote a book by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist from the early 1900s. I think this book was published in 1904. But on page 5 of this book, sorry, that's a symptom of blindness. I just sort of memorized stuff. Just came out, sorry. Page 5, at least on my copy of the book. Page 5, the book is called The Souls of Black Folk. It's a beautiful little book. W.E.B. Du Bois says, being a problem is a strange experience. So, while all of us have problems, some of us not only have problems, but are problems that others have. And that's kind of what disabled people are like in a way, in a certain kind of way. We make an appearance in the world, and we do that in all kinds of ways, and we make an appearance wrapped in the meaning and the feel of problem. So a student, disabled student, appears at university. Now they're a problem. A disabled faculty member appears at a university. Now she or he's a problem. A disabled person appears anywhere, and they are problems. And that's why many of us try to pass as problem-free, which is to say able-bodied in some way or another. Now, Judith Butler, in a little book called Gender Trouble, in the preface, VII, says that trouble is inevitable. It's inevitable. It's kind of like what disability studies scholars say about disability. It's inevitable. And then they say if you live long enough, or something like that. But so it's just like trouble and disability are inevitable in some way or another as a problem. Now I just want to stress the idea of being a problem. And Dubois' right. It's a strange experience for those in the room right now who have had that experience, knowing that your presence is a problem that others have. And so we have the Canadian government that Michael was articulating just a few moments ago, having the problem of disability. But it would do what Foucault says in History of Sexuality, page 25, volume 1, page 25, says that administration or management or the rational mind, following the Enlightenment, Max Weber, suggests that we must transform a people into a population. So now we have a disabled population that the government is, and it's a problem for the government. What are we going to do with this disabled population? And that's why stories are important to the government. Because that could be about individuals in this population, but not about the population. And so that's why government agencies really, really want stats. Rates. And as Foucault says, cycles of life, he calls them. Giving birth, dying, etc., are turned from an actual experience to rates, death rates, birth rates, and so on. And we have rates of disability. And of course, the measure, the most important measurement and most important stat for the government is if these rates go down. So if there's 14% of Canadians who are disabled this year and only 12 next year, it's to be applauded. So the less we're around, the better. At least the government likes it. Now that's an odd kind of a feeling, a strange experience. It's be very difficult for us who are disabled to start applauding the fact that our numbers are dwindling. But it's kind of one of those social facts. In terms of being a problem, we are a problem on a variety of levels. The population problem, the problem of being in the world, in the midst of not only other people, some disabled, some not, racialized, genderized, etc., but we're a problem in the circulation of customs, habits, norms, knowledge that each and every culture has. Customs and knowledge, for the most part, that are invisible. We just know stuff because we know stuff. You know, some people have called that the taken for granted world, the life world, common sense knowledge, etc. And that's the kind of milieu, environment, space, to use the term very vernacular, that we disabled people move in. I move in a space, for example, of blindness. And I move in the space of many blindnesses, not just one meaning or one field. And that's the world in which I move. That's the world in which I am a problem, in a certain kind of way, for certain people. So the thing is that we all need disability to be something. All of us do. And we will manipulate, construct, mold, bend disability, not only for its meaning and feel, but for the meaning and feel we need it to be. Because if disability, for example, is a life celebrated, well then biomedicine and medical practices are and rehab and special ed are going to have a very difficult time existing. Because it's really not the kind of thing that an ophthalmologist goes into to see a patient and says, "I'm really sorry, but you just lost your eyesight." and there's nothing we can do. Now it would be a different matter to go in there and say, sit. You're not going to believe what just happened to you, man. You just went blind. Yeah. See, now would be a different kind of issue. So we need disability in biomedicine to be a problem. And not only a problem, but a problem in need or in search of a solution. Find the cure. Now, you know there's all sorts of organizations that Michael was mentioning, and many, many others that are out to find a cure for us. You know, and so that's one version of solving the problem, is to eliminate it through some sort of cure. Another one, of course, the more effective one, is to prevent it. And so we've got all kind of prevention of disability programs. And failing that, we'll rehab it and special ed it, you know, and try to make this disability approximate the norm as much as possible. So that's kind of what, you know, what our particular culture, many, many cultures now, understand disability to be a problem in need of the solution of normalcy. How do we inculcate, how do we stick normalcy into disability? And that seems to be the solution. Now I'm suggesting, though, that we need to take a look, not so much at disability as a problem in need of a solution, but how such a formulation came about. How is it that that could happen? Because, in some sense, everyone is a problem in need of a solution. You know, an infant is born, now you got a problem. The solution is you have to raise this infant, you know, and love it and all this other kind of stuff, you know. And of course now, contemporary times, we have human development schedules, don't we? You get a 2 months, the child should be saying ooh, and at 2.5 months, they're like ah, and you have to follow all this kind of stuff. And if you don't, well then you're obviously on the autism spectrum or something like that. So it's one of those issues of life itself may and can be understood as a problem in need of a solution. Now we can imagine, I don't have any children, I'm sure most of you are saying, thank God, but it's but we can imagine someone approaching the birth of an infant not as a problem in need of a solution, but as an opportunity for something or other. Now that's a little different matter. It's a much different matter. As an occasion to raise, to cultivate, to love, etc. An occasion to understand that newborn as human. As human. The difficulty, though, is that there are many, many groups of people and many people who are understood as not quite human, even subhuman, to the point where they're a problem in need of a solution. And most of the solutions to the idea of the non-human have been pretty extreme. Genocide, murder. Now we have inclusion as one of the solutions. Pretty extreme stuff. We will include those who are excluded because we know they want to be included by those of us who already excluded them. Now we know we've excluded them because now we want to include them. And had we included them, we wouldn't have to include them. So now we've got a problem. We've got a problem. So the reflections I've had on what we need disability to be is to be able to understand this almost universal, or at least predominant, sense of disability as a problem in need of a solution. So I take that phrase, problem, disability is viewed as a problem in need of a solution. I treat that itself, those 3 words, problem in need of a solution. Wait a second, that's a lot more than 3, 4, 5 words. And I treat that itself as some solution to some problem. Because once we understand disability is a problem in need of a solution, we have solved it. We can now ignore it and focus solely on the solution. Measuring the solution. Gathering statistics on the solution. The disabled people very conveniently fall away because we have resolved disability by formulating disability as a problem in need of a solution. No longer do we need to attend to it. That's why, following, it's sort of a a stretch for me, but following a book called The Invisible Man, written by Ralph Ellison, where he speaks about, among many, many other things, the invisibility of blackness. Insofar as we now have constructed disability as a problem in need of a solution and resolved and solved the problem of disability, it now becomes invisible. Even though it may be right in front of us. The kind of an absent presence. And we all need disability. All of us. And one of the greatest needs of disability, of course, is normalcy's need. Because with disability around, even in its absence, even in its invisibility, normalcy has the occasion and treats it as the occasion to promote and bolster up its sense of a, quote, normal state of human affairs. Disability is not only a fine but a necessary reminder to normalcy of its necessity. And normalcy needs disability to be a problem in need of a solution. Because the solution itself is normalcy. So we'll try the same disability by absenting it, by removing it, or in contemporary language, erasing it, and understanding it merely as a problem in need of a solution. And that can remain our focus, and disability becomes invisible. Invisible. So I just want to end here by saying, I don't know what disability studies needs disability to be. But I think that that's our next, at least in the field of disability studies, I think that that's our next necessary innovation, is to begin to become more self-reflective and realize that we may not have the final or best word on disability. But to realize that we need to start right now, in my opinion, reviewing, uncovering, exploring what we need disability to be in order to be ourselves. What does disability studies need disability to be in order to be disability studies? Now that to me is a crucial question that I think can lead to innovation of some other, not necessarily new versions of disability, because I don't think there really are any, but some understandings of how we've come to understand disability, whether we ourselves understand ourselves as disabled or not. And I want to just remind people of, in a book Thomas King wrote, he quotes an Okanagan storyteller named Jeanette Armstrong. And she says that when she speaks, when I speak, she said, these aren't my words. When I speak through the mouths of my Okanagan people and land, and Okanagan land. And when I speak, I'm merely retelling the same story in different patterns. So when biomedicine speaks about disability, when statistics and the stuff Michael was talking about in terms of research, mainstream research is speaking about disability, it's merely retelling the same story. And even though it doesn't acknowledge stories, it continues to hang on to and perpetuate its own story of disability as a population in need of removal. Thank you.
Now for some questions or comments, and I can bring them. I'll bring my microphone around. I'll ask if you have a question, maybe you can state your name first. Oh, actually, there's a microphone right there. Hello, 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 hello. Yeah.
Tanya from OK. Fantastic presentation. Thanks. I'm having a 5-year volunteer. My thought getting a bit tired. Rod, your last words are really important, I think, for disability studies, and that is, I think we have to ask ourselves from what to become. That is, the way I see disability studies, and I know how we've been talking about in Manitoba, is that we want it to come out of disabled people's movement itself, from the mass of disabled people's experiences. And that's really important because if we get back to this whole thing, and we've been talking about biomedical people, service people, you know, that struggle isn't over yet. We have been colonized by medical and service professionals. That's how I describe myself. I'm colonized. And we have to be very careful that that doesn't creep into what we're doing. And sometimes when we say that we're professionals, even as professionals with disabilities, we kind of start thinking maybe we're the experts. But the real experts are always the community of people with disabilities. If we don't remember that, we won't have disability studies as we need it and want it.
Thanks, Diana. I think you're right in some ways. I think we also have to be careful, whether it's disabled people or professionals like you know, rehabilitators, special educators, etc., to say who has the expertise in disability.
Yes.
Because disability is often formulated as something about which expertise can be developed. So, you know, there's some people in the world about whom others are experts. You know, so transferring expertise from one group to another is part of what we need to do. But I think also what we need to do as disabled people, and you know, I don't know if people agree with this or not, is we have to remember that you know, disability can never be experienced directly, even by disabled people. The experience is always mediated in the actual living life, or some people call it the context or the culture in which we live in. So, how I understand my blindness, for example, doesn't come from me only. It comes from my engagement with my culture and my social context and my situations, many of which, as Tanya says often, is not of my choosing. But so I think we have to really, really begin to understand and think more, or something or other, about this experience we call disability experience, or, you know, just speaking personally for me, what is a blind experience?
Right.
You know, so I think you're right, but I do think we need to stop simplifying. You know, human life, whether individually or collectively, is very complex, and our tendency in this particular historical moment is to reduce it, to be reductionist. You know, and I think we have to try to at least resist a little bit that tendency to reduce. And you know, like blindness means you can't see. Well, it does, but I think it's got, but it's got more to it than that. But thanks, Diana. I think you're right.
Hi, Michelle Owen. I have a question and a public service announcement. First, the public service announcement. In terms of the presidential reception, if I'm reading my ticket right, the information on the schedule is wrong, so I just wanted to save people some trouble. It actually starts at 5, and it's not at Waterloo, it's at Laurier. If you look at your ticket.
Where are we right now?
We're at Laurier. So I didn't want people to go all the way over to Waterloo and then have to come back to Laurier. Okay, but check your own ticket in case I'm wrong. Okay, and question for Michael, and sorry, I'm getting tired too, so maybe you addressed this and I missed it, but I kept thinking when you were talking about the future of disability studies in terms of SHRC not wanting disability research anymore and wanting it moved to CIHR, which we don't really know what the ramifications of that are going to be, but they seem, from my perspective, pretty bleak in the sense that I do disability studies, I don't do necessarily health research, right? And when I even look at the CIHR application, it doesn't work for disability studies. So I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on that in terms of your work.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Just to clarify, I didn't mean to suggest that
the federal government's moving funding away or totally from SHRC to CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research for issues around disability. I mean, SHRC is under pressure, and it will be for a number of years. I think I'll turn this off. Is that one off? Oh, you turned that one off? Okay. But you're quite right. I mean, I've had colleagues for several years who applied to CIHR. I've had graduate students apply. Particularly, I have colleagues in nursing who were encouraged, who do a lot of qualitative and critical research, that they would be welcomed. It's been an uphill climb or swimming against the stream, whatever metaphor you want to use. I think, again, that's to me partly an illustration of the hierarchy of knowledge and methodologies that are privileged. And although some of the websites might say all methodologies are welcome, we welcome more exploratory, qualitative, ethnographic, et cetera, the success rates suggest otherwise. So what some of my colleagues are starting to do, and we're trying to figure out with the help with some of our students and our research admin people at my university, is looking at other sources that, like foundations. Historically, foundations in Canada have not been great supporters of social science research in general. I think that's an area we need to pursue. Again, all these have risks and costs and long shot odds of success at times, but a lot of the research a lot of my students do, and I do at times, does not involve the need for large grants or infrastructure or support. They can be very ethnographic or very specific, and some of it, I think some of Tanya's work is a good example of that, of critical qualitative sociology in a very fine tradition, and you know, very modern way too. So, so I think there's ways of, we have to strategize how to do this. But I wasn't suggesting SHRC was totally getting out of the field.
But it is. Like you didn't suggest that. Like, I have memos from SHRC.
Okay.
Didn't you get the memo?
I guess I didn't get the memo.
We're out now.
Wow.
They don't want disability.
Oh, wow. But they did it for a few years, and we've solved the problem, obviously.
It's done.
We've done it, check. Sorry, sort of. But you're right. I mean, a lot of groups like the one I'm part of with this CURA, this research alliance, you go a lot of trouble to assemble a national partnership of about 6 universities and about 7 local, provincial, and national disability organizations. We meet a lot of time. We're headquartered out of Winnipeg with the CCD. You know, what will happen when the money runs out? And you're quite right, SHRC has gotten out of the CURA business. It does not want to fund those, so we're looking at what other kinds of alternatives. And we're also looking at federal departments, which are under tremendous stress and constraint as well. So I think I'd probably share your, not having seen the memo, I would still probably share your sentiment that the immediate near future looks tougher than the immediate past 5 or 10 years of funding. I think perhaps we've gone through a little wave where the money did ease up after tough restraints of the 90s. It eased up a bit in the last decade or so. It seems to be clamping back down again. And unfortunately, that seems to be fitting with the demographic cycle of people retiring and exiting, and a new, young, untenured group of junior faculty at a time when the research dollars are going to be tighter than ever, and they're being told by university deans and other administrators to, you know, you got to get this, you got to get that, you got to be a research team. The cultures of the universities have shifted. They need to be, in a way, we need to reevaluate not only just what is disabilities and what can it be, but quite honestly, what are universities and what can they be over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So I think you're right. We illustrate, I think, a larger structural issue there. So thanks for telling me about the memo. I'm in shock now. Well, I'm obviously a more senior, tenured professor at the end of my career, so this doesn't pose as much a direct concern to me. But I work with a lot of junior people that try to bring along to energize and invigorate and be doctoral and graduate students. So this is distressing. Okay, go ahead.
All right, thank you. My name is Robbie Ethelder, and I'll remain true to my activist roots because I'm an activist turned graduate student. So as you know, someone who has a history with URDCO and with CAMD, Canadian Association of Muslims with Disabilities, I have to put a question. This is entitled the Equity Panel. I've sat here yesterday and today and reflected and gained a lot of wonderful knowledge, been able to put voices to names that I've heard, fantastic names who have done fantastic work. And the question, I guess, that comes to mind for me as an activist is when we are looking at disability studies and we're talking power, we're talking anti-oppression, oppression, we're talking about defining the language, we're talking about, you know, the numbers that the feds require, etc. How are we engaging? And you know, we've kind of talked about, I guess, Rod, you had talked about connecting, keeping that connection to activism, I believe. Everything's getting murky, so it's all blending together. But my memory's slipping because as a blind woman, I've had 4 kids. Rod, you acknowledge that you weren't a parent, but I've gone there, been there, and my memory doesn't work that well anymore. But essentially what I'm asking is, what about those absent voices, absent presence of equity and diversity that is in fact a part of the Canadian mosaic that is increasing its quote-unquote numbers in our grassroots populations, that is disengaged at a power platform, let me put it that way, in terms of disability rights and the disability rights movement, and who does the research, who talks about the research, who gets funded for the research. Silence?
No, we're deciding who's going. I think I'm going. It's Tanya talking. In particular, I think that you had a lot of questions. I'm just going to take one angle in. I think that the issue or the connection and the similarities and differences between disability and race should be perplexing to us, should be something that we need to, so I'm translating diversity into questions of race. And I think that the historical disconnect, that disability was used so often as a put down, a control mechanism, and is today used as a put down and a control mechanism. It's sort of how we're doing racism in the schools today. So, and there's a long historical way of pitting disability and race against each other. I think that however disability and race are connected, that needs more examination, more narratives, more venues to articulate the multiple ways that we've used one category of dehumanized human to disadvantage or disqualify another category of dehumanized human. And I just think that that's really, the work we're doing with Ronaldo Walcott, Rod Michalko, and myself, that's really where we're trying to push things to the question of, I guess it's a critical humanism. When we talk race, or when we talk disability, and we leave one side or the other out, or we use one as a metaphor for the other, what's happening to our concept of human there? And that's where I'm going with your questioning right there. But I'll pass it along the panel. Do you want this?
Yeah. I was at a conference in Toronto about a month or so ago, the Metropolis Conference, which is an annual huge conference. And I was invited to be on a panel to do with the question of, it was specifically on newcomer and immigrant population, particularly after living in Canada for 5 or 10 years, and the rates of disability, despite official laws and immigration policies in Canada to screen out or discourage admissions of people with disabilities into this country, that there's a phenomenon there of people with disabilities within a variety of so there's the ethno-racial community, multicultural community, there's the disability community, and there's the immigrant newcomer community. And they kind of connect and misconnect in a lot of ways. And on my website, I got a paper I gave it called Missing Connections, and it's really a call for people in all 3 communities to better interact. And we've got community, ERTCO like yourself, there's the Muslim groups, so there's faith groups, language groups, race and ethnic groups. Some would get defined as multicultural or and maybe Canadian-born, but there's also the newcomer immigrant population and literature there, and settlement literature. It's not that well connected to other fields of critical social science or disability studies, and we need to do a better job of making those connections. At that conference, a couple of service providers, one out of Erdco, one out of Manitoba that's doing some really interesting work there, and Doug Durst, who's a professor of social work at Regina, I believe, they wanted to do kind of a collection of readings that start to explore better those connections and the voices of people from those three communities and how they interact, overlap, interact in different ways. So that's a partial response to you, but you're quite right. Another would be, I have to say, I'd be amiss not to, Indigenous communities, Aboriginal Canadians. Disability studies is not done, and the groups I've worked with, we do a mea culpa almost every other week, saying, you know, how do we better connect? And it's an ongoing conversation and struggle to make connections with other groups. And so, but there's a real agenda there for it. So that should be absolutely part of the future of where disability studies should be thought to be and where it should be heading. Rod, do you want to?
Well, I don't know, interpreting your question. I'm not exactly sure what disability studies has done for disabled people. I'm just not 100% sure about that. You know, I mean, I have some thoughts, but I really don't know. I think though that we need to be a little cautious or just a little careful. I mean, for example, disability studies is an activity. It's an endeavor. It's a practice. It's something we do in the world, in the same way we do having lunch, drinking coffee, whatever. You know, it's a practice in the world. It's not outside the world. And given in North America, for example, I'll just speak about North America, disability studies is done in a world which is racist, sexist, ableist. Disability studies are those things. It's done in that world. So that's what I'm suggesting. You know, when you ask where the voices are, that's a very, very not only interesting but very, very good question. Yeah, where are the voices? And sometimes we have to locate those voices. And sometimes we have to locate those voices in each other and in us. So it's not just let's gather that group over there, because when we get that group, do we hear the voice? Who's doing the speaking? What stories are being told, or you know, what's the narrative of that particular group? So I think the voices is a complex kind of there are, for instance, the complexities, and you know, I've learned so much about my blindness from so many blind people, and I've learned so much about my blindness from so many sighted people. So where is the voice of blindness? Is it just what I say, or what you say, or other blind people say? Am I the expert in blindness? I mean, these are just questions. So I think voice is a bit more complicated than just people speaking up.
All right, maybe we can move the discussion to something more informal, and there are refreshments in the hallway. Thank you very much, and thank you for our